In 1954, a famous photographer did a whole series of photographs on the Jesuits that were featured in Life magazine, which was a popular photojournalistic magazine at that time in the United States. And she took photos at Sacred Heart Novitiate, among many other places, but she took them at Sacred Heart Novitiate in Los Gatos, California, the novitiate of the then California province of the Society of Jesus. And she took pictures in particular of novices out in the fields. This novitiate was out in the country, as all the novitiates were in the United States at that time, surrounded by grapevines. And we had a winery that the novices worked at. We produced wine for sacramental purposes mainly, so we sold to. And so she took pictures of the novices picking grapes out in the fields, and they were a bit fictionalized because she wanted the novices, of course, in cassocks because she thought it would be a great photo, and it is. They are great photos, but of course the novices probably would have died of heat stroke and ruined their cassocks. No, they were wearing work clothes normally when they picked, but for the photos they wore cassocks. And it is a striking image of these novices in matching black cassocks, essentially in a Jesuit habit, out in a rural spot, working in the fields, a very much more monastic vision of Jesuit life. And the story that I want to start to unravel today in this lecture is how we got there. It seems far from Ignatius's and the early Jesuits' vision of Jesuit life. And the question is, how did we get to a more monastic style of being Jesuits? And I would argue that it starts before the suppression of the Society of Jesus, but that the suppression and the restoration of the Society has a huge impact on how we move in that direction. Because we had always had a certain tension in the Society of Jesus about whether we were religious enough, whether we were like other religious orders enough, and we were nervous about the things that made us different. But the suppression taught us that the things that made us different could get us suppressed, that the things that made us different brought us hatred, brought us desolation. And so there was a real impulse after the restoration of the Society to avoid those things, to focus on ways of keeping our heads down and making us more like other religious orders. Discernment-wise, there's some real things to consider there. Ignatius notes in the Rules of Discernment of Spirits that although we ought not to change our formal resolutions in times of desolation, it is very profitable to make vigorous changes in ourselves against the desolation. For example, by insisting more on prayer, meditation, earnest self-examination, and some suitable way of doing penance. We're not to change our resolutions, but we are to examine ourselves, to think carefully about why we're doing what we're doing, about who we are. And that's the thing I want to do. I want to do a little bit of an examine of how the Jesuits were at the time of the Restoration and how our discernments were, and to think about how we can, whether we did this, not changing our resolutions, but insisting more on prayer, meditation, examination, penance, or whether we changed something that we should not have changed. That's the question that I want to pose today. In order to get to the actual moment of the restoration of the Society, I want to talk about various ways that the Society survived during the suppression. We know that there were informal networks that were kept up during the Society, like Josephine Natelli, and I'll talk about another one. We know that there was the actual survived, the remnant, so to speak, of the Society in Russia, and there were also people who decided, well, we're going to form a new religious orders that are like the Jesuits, or maybe, in the opinion of some of them, better than the Jesuits. So there were these various means of survival. So let me talk about them for a minute because they factor into this story. An interesting case study in survival during the Society are the English Jesuits. Basically, what happened was the Jesuits were suppressed in England, but the Vicar Apostolic of the English Catholic Mission, this is missionary territory, it's not legal to be a Catholic priest in England at this time. The Vicar Apostolic, so the Pope's representative, decided to, yes, suppress the society, but to let the former Jesuits remain unified, to remain living in together, working together, running what they had been running, because he thought that they were really important. So he took the last Jesuit provincial of the English Jesuits, whose name, strangely enough, is Thomas More, but just not that Thomas More, and he made him vicar over the former Jesuits within his district. So the Jesuits in England kind of stayed loosely together, and in fact, a lot of them started re-entering through Russia in 1783. Although they don't fully become a province again until 1829, some years after the Restoration. So in some cases, Jesuits kind of just kept doing what they'd been doing. And we see that also like in Georgetown, as I was talking about in the last lecture, in Georgetown and in the United States, where ex-Jesuits are running a college along Jesuit lines and then re-enter the society. There were also people who didn't have quite as much freedom of being off in the colonies, away from the supervision, the notice of the church hierarchy in Rome, and those folks kept up informal networks. Sometimes, some of them, people like Pignatelli, who we've already talked about, but also Luigi Mozzi di Capitani. Kept informal networks of Jesuits, tried to take care of former Jesuits. This is somebody who entered the society in 1763, and he was still a scholastic at the time of the suppression, but he was ordained a priest in 1776. And he kept up this huge correspondence with ex-Jesuits, telling news, story, encouragement, also sharing, if you heard anyone, telling about prophecies for the restoration of the society, which were obviously proved true. So, he kept up the fight against Jansenist movements in the church. It was a very classic Jesuit thing to do, fight those Jansenists, fight for a more pastoral approach. He did Jesuit-style rural missions, preaching basically 18th annotation exercises. So he kind of did his best to stay in the Jesuits and just keep up with former Jesuits, work with former Jesuits. And he re-entered the society in 1801 in Italy, and took his final vows in 1803, because of course he had not taken final vows before. And he kind of became Joseph Pignatelli's right-hand man in the governance of the Italian province. So we've got informal networks, we've got kind of weird remnant survivals, obviously in Russia, but also in places like England and in the United States. And then we've got the new congregations. Two in particular, the Society of the Sacred Heart and the Society of the Faith of Jesus, are worth noting. The Society of the Sacred Heart was, both of these were not founded by ex-Jesuits. They were founded by people who kind of wanted to be Jesuits and even thought, well, we can do better than the Jesuits. And in fact, the better of the Society of the Sacred Heart, which was in France, was more emphasis on devotion and traditional contemplative and penitential practices in the society. And the better of the Society of the Faith of Jesus, which is sometimes called the Pecanarists, sorry with my pronunciations, which were based out of Rome. They thought they could improve the society by making it more devoted to the Pope. Not they need to not just follow the Pope's orders for missions, but to be more personally devoted to the Pope. But also they were very kind of apocalyptic in their focus and very kind of ecstatic in their prayer. And both of these orders had female contemplative branches as well, which is something that the Jesuits have never had. And actually these two groups joined together in 1799. And members of both of these orders, some of them eventually come into the Jesuits, although that's a little bit problematic. Pecanari himself is a very problematic figure. Unfortunately, he was actually condemned by the Holy Office in 1808, found him guilty of pretense of holiness, both because he was peddling all these prophecies that they saw as false, as well as it seemed that he was engaging horribly enough, this is not a new sin in the church, in sexual solicitation of penitents. So therefore, it's pretense of holiness. That sounds like a weird charge for that, but meaning using his sacred powers in a way that was sinful and evil. But one of the main things about these orders is precisely that they think that they can do better than the Jesuits of being Jesuits, and in fact, they come into a lot of conflict with the members of the informal networks that then become formal Jesuits again through Russia. In 1799, Mozzi, who was, as I was just talking about, writes a letter to Peccannari referring to the the name of it is the Society of the Faith of Jesus, as a schismatic branch of the Society of Jesus. He writes, "How could we acknowledge in the order you founded the restoration of the Society of Jesus, since you don't depend on and don't have any relationship with the Society of Jesus legitimately active in Russia?" This is important to know because it points to the mess. The restoration of the society was not a neat thing. A lot of things had happened in the intervening years, and there were a lot of tensions about what it meant to be a Jesuit. What did it mean to remain true to the Jesuits? And so there's a lot of questions at the time of the general congregations that once the society is fully restored about whether Peccannarists could, who have now entered the Society of Jesus, are they allowed to be in positions of authority? Could a Peccannarist be the general of the society? Because there's a real doubt as to their fidelity from some. So there starts to be camps and tensions in the society because of this legitimate angst, this real angst, maybe not always legitimate, but this real angst about what does this all mean? How do we put the Society of Jesus back together? So there's these real fears and tensions because this was a dramatic and an awful moment for the society. A moment that lasted from 1773 until 1814. Now, the actual restoration was an incredibly joyful moment. As the story goes, the Pope, Pius VII, on August 7th, 1814, celebrates Mass at the altar of St. Ignatius in the Jesuit. Why was the society restored on August 7th? Because of people who were late and procrastinating. They meant to restore the society on the feast of St. Ignatius on the 31st of July, but they didn't get the paperwork done. And so they decided they would celebrate it on the octave of the feast of St. Ignatius, the restoration. Just a little fun fact, in case you were wondering if procrastination is a new thing. So the Pope celebrates Mass at the altar of St. Ignatius in the Jesuit, and then he goes into a side chapel called the Chapel of the Nobili family. It's still there. I've been in it. I've actually celebrated Mass in it. And he reads the bull of restoration of the society and then individually receives each of the 150 men gathered before him as restored members of the Society of Jesus. An incredibly joyful moment. And the question, of course, is why was the society restored? Well, that's an important thing for us to understand about the way the history goes forward from this moment. The bull is very specific about why it's restoring the society. Because of the wreck of the church and society, because not our society, meaning the society, just society more generally. Clement XIV thought he was going to save the church, apparently, by giving up the Society of Jesus. But what happened was the French Revolution. What happened was discord. What happened was growing anti-Catholic sentiment. What happened was a lot of problems. And the thought of Pius VII is that the church needed the Jesuits to respond to the tumult of the world, which is the most stirring part of the entire bull, where he says, "We believe that it would be a matter of gravest offense in the presence of the Lord if in such grave necessity of public matters we would fail to put into action what salutary helps that God with singular providence furnishes for us. And if we, gathered together in the ship of Peter, shaken and cast about by continual whirlwinds, were to reject such expert and gallant rowers who offer themselves to break the waves of the open sea that at every moment threaten us with shipwreck and ruin. The Jesuits are the available, willing, gallant, as he says, rowers who are going to help the church as it is buffeted about by waves. And there's something really beautiful and very true to who we are as Jesuits about that. But there's also the dark side of that, which is the Pope really wants the order of the world to be what it was and is never going to be again. And so he wants the Jesuits to get things back to how they were in the ancien regime, in the ancient regime. He wants Catholic monarchies and education and philosophy and all these things to be the same. And so he's basically telling Jesuits, do it like you've always done it. Be as conservative as possible, because that's how we're going to serve the church. Let's try to get back to how we were. And that's going to be a little problematic. It's going to be a little problematic. But the key thing in all of that is what he wants is the society to be back in education, as he says in the bull. Thus, in order that in such a way the companions united in a religious group might occupy themselves in the education of youth in religion and in the arts, that they might direct seminaries and colleges, and with the approval and consent of the ordinaries of the localities, listen to confessions, announce the word of God, and freely administer the sacraments. To avail himself particularly of the labor of the regular clerics of the Society of Jesus, to teach Christian piety and the fear of God, which is the beginning of wisdom, and to instruct youth in letters and sciences in colleges and public schools. He's not really focused on restoring the society for our missionary efforts. He makes no mention of the missions in the Bull of Restoration. What he's interested in us is getting back into schools, which is, of course, the thing that we mostly got suppressed for was schools, because schools are this battleground between these competing visions of the world, education, and all these sorts of things. However, it's really important to understand, even though he doesn't mention the missions, even though there's this emphasis, even though you can say, oh, well, the politics of this are not as heartening as they might be, because maybe this is the Pope clinging to the past and nonetheless, it is a full and complete restoration of the Society of Jesus. It's not the founding of a new order. It's not a change. This is the Jesuits are being called back exactly according to the same legal framework that we had had before. Everything is restored. And so the Jesuits are as free to serve the church as they were before in all the various ways that they did before. So important to keep in mind. The first general congregation after the suppression, General Congregation 20, following on the 1759 General Congregation 19, and then there's those 5 in Russia, it doesn't happen until 1820, because there is this vicar general who becomes the superior general at the time of the Restoration in Russia, Tadeusz Brzozowski. And so it's not until he died in 1820 that they hold a new general congregation. Interesting enough, as soon as he dies, the new Tsar, Alexander I, exiles all the Jesuits from Russia. So we really only survived in Russia during the suppression. It seems like the expulsion might have well been because of the Restoration. Alexander did not like the new papal influence on things. He didn't like the fact that Brzozowski, for example, wanted to go back to Rome. He didn't like all this papal interference. So to the extent that we were kept alive from the point of view of the emperors of Russia, the empress and then the emperor of Russia, was as a thumbing their nose at papal authority. Well, as soon as papal authority was back, they weren't really interested in us anymore. But at any rate, in 1820, there is a new general congregation to elect a new superior. And what happens at this general congregation? Of course, peace, love, harmony. Jesuits are all back together. There's a huge fight. And the huge fight is between newcomers and veterans. Veterans of the old society, meaning people who had entered the society before the suppression, and newcomers who either joined these quasi-Jesuit groups, like what I was talking about, the Pecanarists and all that, or they entered through the Russian novitiate during the time of the suppression, people like Jan Rutan. And the veterans are questioning the validity of the vows that people took through Russia, and they want control of the congregation. If this sounds familiar, the people are saying these people are not Jesuit enough to be in control of this congregation. It sounds familiar because it's what Bobadilla was arguing at the First General Congregation, that only the people mentioned in the bull founding the Society Regimenti Militantis Ecclesiae should be in control of that congregation. Now, once again, there's an argument that only the veterans, only the people who've really been around should be in charge. And there's this conservative impulse. And so these two groups do what Jesuits often do, but should not, which is they go to the papal curia and they get defenders in the papal curia to fight their fight for them. The veterans get Cardinal de la Ganga, who is eventually Pope Leo XII. Seems like they backed the right horse. He wants to stop the congregation, wants to commission to correct abuses. He wants to do all these sorts of things. The newcomers get Cardinal Consalvi on their side. And you might think that the veterans would be the ones to win out, but they weren't. Cardinal Consalvi gets the ear of the Pope, Pius VII, and Pius VII sides with the newcomers and says, no. People who have entered the Society of Jesus during the suppression or entered it right after the suppression from these other orders are Jesuits. And the congregation starts according to the ordinary rules of a congregation without excluding anyone. And the Pope ratifies all the vows that were taken through Russia, and the usual rituals proceed. An important moment for us, because I think it could have been pretty devastating for the Society of Jesus if we had started kind of another litmus test for who's really a Jesuit. But it does highlight the desolation at this time. It does highlight the confusion. It does highlight all of the problems that are going on, all the fear that's impacting our discernment. What does it really mean to be a Jesuit at this time? And there's this desire to change things, change who should be a Jesuit. But what we really we were invited to, but weren't always that great at this time, was more prayer, more self-examination, more thoughtfulness about what we were doing. But what was happening was a lot of knee-jerk reactions. Nevertheless, we elected Luigi Fortis on the second ballot for that congregation, who is, in fact, was one of the veterans of the old society, which was probably a good move given the turmoil. And the main concern of the congregation is to establish that this is not a new society, which is where Decree 6 comes in, that emphasizes, to be sure, there can scarcely be any doubt that both the constitutions given by our most holy father and founder and whatever the fathers have widely judged to be added to them in the course of time possess their full binding power. The Society of Jesus is the same as it was. Now, experientially, it's not, in the sense that there's a lot of continuity has been lost, and there's a lot of rebuilding to do. But what they're saying is we want to be in continuity, and we're going to follow, as best as we know, the same rules. We're going to try to stay true to who we are as Jesuits. We're going to try to understand who we are as Jesuits, not as a new order, but as Jesuits. There's an interesting comment that I'd like to end with from the Jesuit historian at the time of the suppression, who wrote a history of the suppression of the society, in which he says the following, while the society was still suppressed. I hold for certain that the Jesuits who follow us, because he was sure we were going to come back, will be more cautious. Schooled by the calamities that befell us, they will avoid the hatred of men, especially of religious. They will never extol themselves above others with a sense of self-importance. They will always keep themselves within the boundaries of modesty. I think he's right. I think he thinks, though, that he's saying something good. And I'm not sure that he is. Because what he's saying is we're going to avoid causing trouble because we don't want to be in trouble. And the truth is, as Jesuits, we cause the trouble if that's where our availability, our obedience, and our service of Christ in Christ Church takes us. That's our call. We're not avoiding trouble because we don't want trouble, but we're not causing trouble because we want trouble. But what happens at the time of the Restoration is we're so afraid. What does it mean to be a Jesuit? And we don't want to be suppressed. And how do we do all these sorts of things? That there's this real concern to change things so that we are more like other religions, when it is a time not to change things, but to examine carefully who we are. A time of desolation in which we should stay true to our fundamental call. And this is going to prove problematic for the society. Now, there's lots of great things that are going to happen for the society in the 19th century and beyond. This is not the end of the story, as you know, but it is an important thing for us to learn from, because it is so dramatic that it highlights the dangers of not being careful in our discernments about what spirits are moving us, because we weren't always as careful as we might have been. And that's worth mulling over and reflecting on. Thank you.